You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
When I was growing up, my paternal grandfather would always make latkes whenever any of his grandchildren were over visiting. Now, these weren't the potato latkes that you're probably familiar with. Instead, these were made from matzah meal. And I have to tell you, we all love them. We just sprinkle a little bit of sugar, well, honestly, a lot of sugar on them, and they'd be eaten very quickly. And of course, today, whenever any of us get together, and I sadly have to say that's mostly via Zoom these days, we all look back on those latkes with great fondness. But unlike me, most of them never got to experience the one bad batch that my grandfather made. I would guess I was in my mid-20s at this point, fresh out of college, and my grandparents are probably in their early to mid-90s. I remember that it was a beautiful summer day, so I decided to take a ride over to their place to say hello. And there we were, the three of us sitting under the trees having a nice conversation, when my grandmother suddenly turned to my grandfather and said, "Jack, why don't you make Stevie some latkes?" And as you can guess, a few minutes later, he emerged from the kitchen with a plate of hot latkes. I took one bite and I wanted to puke, and I'm not exaggerating here, they really were that bad. What happened was that my grandfather had reused the oil that he had previously cooked liver in. Yes, I was eating liver-flavored latkes. Yuck. Now, of course, I didn't want to hurt my grandfather's feelings, so I just struggled to swallow every bite, and it really was a struggle. Well, it was probably about 15 minutes into that plate of latkes when all of a sudden one of my cousins drove up. And I am not going to mention his name, although if you ask anyone in my family, I'm certain they know exactly who he'd be. Anyway, he took one bite of a latke and he just spit it out all over the ground. So much for me pretending I was enjoying them. The reality is that we all end up in situations from time to time where we feel it's necessary to tell a white lie. It may be that we're doing it to avoid hurting someone's feelings, to get out of a situation we're uncomfortable with, or in my case, to avoid hurting my grandparents' feelings. Well, today I have a story of another white lie. And this is one that a New Hampshire doctor and his wife have been keeping from their children, their friends, and the community for a couple of decades. At least that was until the federal government discovered the lie. The reality was that their little deception never hurt anyone. It was a lie that they told out of necessity. But once Reader's Digest published a story in December of 1947, everyone across the nation would learn the truth and their lives would forever be changed. So today I present to you that story, which I've given the obvious title of A White Lie. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
To begin the story, we're going to go back to 1900, nice round number. To be specific, August 17th of 1900. And that's when Albert and Macy Johnson welcomed their newborn son, Albert Chandler Johnson, into the world. And he would be the first of their three children, all of whom were boys. Educated in the Chicago public schools, young Albert excelled in his studies. So after graduation, he went on to earn his Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Chicago, and after that, he began his studies to become a doctor at Chicago's Rush Medical College. It was in September of 1923 that his life would forever be changed. That's when 19-year-old Boston resident Thyra Agatha Bauman opted to take a 2-week vacation to Chicago. And that's because her family knew a couple there who had a daughter who was around Thyra's age. And while she was visiting, that daughter arranged for her to go on several dates, and one of them was with Albert. It was love at first sight. The two spent a lot of time together, and on the day before Thyra was scheduled to return to Boston, Albert took her to the university to show her around, made a visit to his fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi, and then he suggested that she stay in Chicago and marry him. But when Thyra informed her parents that she was engaged, they were not happy. But, after he came to Boston and finally met them, they did offer up their approval. Thyra and Albert were married on Christmas Day, that's December 25th of 1924. Initially, the two did live together, but after their son Albert Chandler Johnson Jr. was born 1 year later, that's on December 19th, the couple was forced to live apart. So Thyra returned to Boston with their newborn, while Albert Sr. remained in Chicago to continue with his medical studies. As you can probably guess, it was financial hardship that made this separation necessary. And one thing that's not mentioned in all the tellings of the story is that Albert Sr.'s father, that was another Albert, Albert V. Johnson, he was a real estate agent in Chicago. He had passed away around the time Albert and Thyra first met, and of course that would leave him without family support for college. Couple that with the high cost of medical school, the expenses of housing, supporting a new family. He had to work all his spare hours, every single vacation, every night. And he took on a wide range of jobs, including working as a railroad waiter, as a porter, and he pulled long night shifts at the post office. It was tough, but he made it through, and he had now just one final step to complete before Rush would issue him a medical degree. He was required to get some real-world experience by interning at a first-rate hospital. But Albert was having a tough time finding a placement. You see, the only hospitals that were willing to accept him did not meet the college's high standards, so he just kept applying to hospitals all around the country. Well, his luck changed when he received a welcoming telegram from Maine General Hospital in Portland, Maine, and I should point out Maine General Hospital is today known as Maine Medical Center. Anyway, after that, the Johnsons were off to Portland. And upon completion of his internship, the head of the board of registration at the hospital, he told Albert that a friend of his, Dr. H. Bryan, had recently passed on, and that Albert should look into taking over his general practice. So Albert traveled to the small town of Gorham, New Hampshire, population 2,500, and located at the base of Mount Washington, and he liked what he saw. Generously, Dr. Bryan's widow offered to sell all her husband's equipment and his goodwill for $1,000, which is roughly $20,000 today. He agreed to make the purchase, obtained a $2,000 loan from a Gorham bank, rented a 5-room furnished apartment, and it wasn't long before the rest of the family joined him there. Of course, being a country doctor was very demanding. At a time when doctors still made house calls, he could get called out at just about any hour of the day, to deal with a birth, an emergency, or whatever. But he loved the job, and he loved the people of Gorham. Dr. Johnson was now making very good money, and with an ever-growing family, I should note that they would eventually have 3 sons and a daughter, they decided that they needed a larger home. And when I say large, I mean large. They purchased a 3-story, 17-room house, complete with a large reception hall, which sat high up on a hill that overlooked the town. The Johnsons were immediately accepted into the Gorham community. Dr. Johnson was elected to the school board, was a member of the Masonic Lodge, and a member of the Rotary Club. Mrs. Johnson was active in civic work, was twice asked to assume the presidency of the Gorham Women's Club, and she served as president of the White Mountain Junior League of the Congregational Church. Well, they'd been living in that large home for 3 years when Dr. Johnson received an offer to become a röntgenologist at a nearby hospital. Now, you may not be familiar with that term. Today we refer to them as radiologists. Anyway, the only catch was, in order for him to get this job, is that he needed to go back to college to get the necessary training. And with that, the Johnsons picked up and moved to Boston for a year. They rented an apartment in Brookline, enrolled their children in public school, and Dr. Johnson began a postgraduate course in röntgenology at Harvard. Then, upon completion of his studies, Dr. Johnson took a radiology position at the hospital in Keene, New Hampshire, and Keene is located about 100 miles or 160 kilometers southwest of Gorham. But with a population that was roughly 5 times that of Gorham, they were concerned about fitting in, but once again, the community quickly accepted them. Around the same time, their son Albert Jr. was accepted to the Mount Hermon Boys Preparatory School in Gill, Massachusetts, and that's around a 40-minute drive from their new home in Keene. And while this may seem like a very, very minor detail, you'll soon see that it plays a pivotal part in the story. Needless to say, the Johnsons loved their new life in Keene, so they purchased another large home, and the house is still there. It's at the corner of Washington and Beaver Streets. If you go to Google Maps and check it out, it's quite the impressive house. When the 1940s rolled around, it was becoming increasingly clear that the U.S. would somehow get pulled into World War II. And of course, wars need doctors. So the U.S. Navy approached Dr. Johnson twice with offers of a commission, but he initially declined. But after thinking about it a bit, he realized he'd eventually get the call and concluded that if he applied early, he would get a better placement. And that's exactly what he did. He traveled to Boston for his physical. Now, I did find his World War II draft registration card online, and it describes his physical features as the following. 41 years old, 5 feet 4.5 inches tall, that's about 164 centimeters. He weighed 142 pounds or 64.5 kilograms, had brown hair, brown eyes, white race, and a dark complexion. Albert was a bit too short and overweight for active combat, but there was a shortage of radiologists, so they decided to accept him. He was informed that he'd be appointed as lieutenant commander in the Navy. Albert was overjoyed and he told everyone that he knew about it. That was until a young man in a uniform came to his door. He said, quote, "Dr. Johnson, I'm sent here by the Bureau of Naval Intelligence to ask you a few questions," unquote. He then glanced down at a sheet of paper and asked, quote, "You graduated from the University of Chicago in 1924, unquote. And then he asked a bit more and politely excused himself, thanking the doctor for his time. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail from the Navy's Bureau of Investigation. Dated August of 1941, it was brief and stated that they were unable to approve his application because of his, quote, "inability to meet naval physical requirements," unquote. Around the same time that his father received the rejection, Albert Jr. got an unexpected surprise. That's because a major scheme he was approaching, and the coach at Mount Hermon selected 6 boys to represent the school. Now, Albert Jr. wasn't one of those initially chosen, but his close friend Charlie Duncan was. And Charlie believed that Albert was actually the stronger skier and offered to give up his spot so Albert could compete instead. Well, the coach was impressed by this and he decided to expand the group to 7, so both boys were allowed to attend the meet. Needless to say, Albert was elated by the news and decided to hitchhike home for the weekend to tell his parents what had happened. But as soon as he stepped into the house, he could sense something was wrong. His father was clearly troubled. Of course, Albert Jr. didn't know about the military's decision yet, but he was about to find out. Clearly, this wasn't a good time to talk to his father, so he went upstairs to take a bath in the bathroom that adjoined his parents' bedroom. And typical of most teenagers, his plan was simply to go out with some girls that evening. As he began to fill the tub with water, he told his parents of what had happened. You know, how Charlie Duncan had given up his seat, how good of both a student and an athlete Charlie Duncan was, and how much everyone liked Charlie even though he was black. It was at that very moment that Dad turned to his wife Thyra and said, quote, "I'm going to tell that boy," unquote. She begged him not to do so, but he poured himself a stiff drink, his third of the evening, and returned to the bathroom door. He told his son to turn off the water and said, quote, "Do you know something, boy?" His son answered, "No, what?" Dad's reply was, "Well, you're colored." It was true. Dr. and Mrs. Johnson were African American, but their skin was light enough so that the two of them could pass for being white. And that was their white lie. They were lying that they were white. The couple then went on to explain everything to their son, but they cautioned that he must keep it a secret, even from his younger siblings. That's because if word got out, Dr. Johnson risked not only his career, but also the respect of their friends and their neighbors. So now I'm going to rewind the clock a bit, and that's because I was skipping over little details so that I keep you in suspense for a bit. It is true that Dr. Johnson grew up in Chicago, but it turns out he was just one of 2 black students in his high school graduating class. And as I mentioned, he was relatively light-skinned, but his father, who I'm going to call Papa Johnson just for clarity, he was even lighter. And that allowed Papa Johnson to pass as white, and that opened the door to a successful career in real estate. Now, Papa Johnson's family had always lived in the North and they had never been enslaved, but the same couldn't be said of Mama Johnson. That was Macy Johnston. That's because she was from the South and both of her parents had been enslaved in Mississippi. As mentioned earlier, Dr. Johnson studied at Rush Medical College, where he was one of only 2 black students in his class. Now, the reason for this is quite simple. They had a quota that only allowed 2 black students each year. And at the time, nearly every Rush student completed their internship at nearby Presbyterian Hospital. But for Albert and the other black student, that requirement was quietly set aside. And that's because administrators feared the hospital's patients would object to being treated by black physicians. As for why Dr. Johnson had such a difficult time finding a hospital to intern at, that was very simple. Of the 4 black hospitals in the U.S. that were open to black interns at the time, none of them met the high standards that Rush accepted. So he applied to other hospitals, but once they learned of his race, they turned him down. So when he applied to Maine General, his wife Thyra suggested he simply not state his race, unless they asked him. And since they never asked, he never told them. And that's when the two began living as a white couple. Okay, so we just took a deep dive into Dr. Johnston's background. Now let's look at his wife Thyra's background. One of her grandfathers, who was indeed white, had moved from Germany to New Orleans, and he found great success there. He became the shipping commissioner of the port of New Orleans. But his wife, that's Thyra's grandmother, she was black. Of course, they had a son who was Thyra's father, and even though he was very light-skinned, because he had 1 drop of black blood in his veins, he was considered black. And of course, as you know, in the early 1900s, there was segregation everywhere in the South. That was except in federal offices. And that really worked out well for Thyra's father because he was able to work as a clerk in the post office there. But after Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912, her dad feared even greater segregation in New Orleans, and he asked to be transferred to a post office up in Boston. He got that transfer, and Thyra was 9 years old when they moved north. Well, I couldn't confirm this. One source said that Thyra was only 1/8 black, so as you can imagine, her skin was very light. In addition, she had light brown hair and blue eyes, so it was easy for her to pass as a white woman. And that's exactly what she did. Before she married, when she applied for jobs in Boston, she purposely left the question of race blank on the applications. Then when it came time for her dating, Thyra's dad was very concerned about his daughter dating a darker-skinned man. Passing as a white person entitled them to many privileges that they were denied as black people back in New Orleans, and of course he didn't want her to be subjected to all that discrimination. Which is why they were so concerned when Thyra took that 2-week trip out to Chicago and got engaged to Albert Johnston. Now, her parents knew he was black, but they wouldn't allow the marriage to go forward unless they met him in person. They wanted to make sure that he wasn't dark-skinned. Of course, when Albert took over the late Dr. Bryant's practice in Gorham, they continued to keep their racial secret. Now, this is a time when Gorham had a KKK chapter, and neither blacks, Jews, or Catholics were very welcome. But since no one ever asked them their race, they never told anyone, and no one appears to have figured it out. Which brings us back to that rejection from the Navy. When Dr. Johnson applied to the Navy, he was fully aware that they thoroughly investigated the background of all commissions, but he was willing to take that risk. It's unknown how the Navy discovered that he was black, but it probably wasn't very difficult. Not only did his World War I draft registration card list his race as Negro, but so did his birth certificate. And then, of course, he was a member of Kappa Alpha Psi in medical school, which is an African American fraternity. Which meant that when the young man from the Bureau of Naval Intelligence showed up at his door to ask him some questions, they already knew. And one of the questions he asked that I didn't mention before was, quote, "We understand that even though you're registered as white, you have colored blood in your veins," unquote. To which Dr. Johnson replied, quote, "Who knows what blood any of us has in his veins," unquote. Of course, several days later, that letter of rejection arrived in the mail, and we're now back at the moment when Albert and Thyra told their son that he was black. Albert Jr. had spent the first 16 years of his life thinking he was white. Now he'd have to adapt to being a light-skinned black man. Let's just say he didn't handle it well. After graduation from Mount Hermon, he went on to study at Dartmouth, but he wasn't able to adapt. When he was nearly on the verge of suicide, his father had to come and take him out of college. After that, he joined the Navy, where he did pass as white, but he ended up in a psychiatric hospital there. They discharged him as a, quote, psychoneurotic unclassified, unquote. The young man was clearly a lost soul. Then one day, a friend from back in Gorham named Walt called to say that he was hitchhiking to Syracuse, New York, and asked if he'd like to come along. Albert agreed, and soon the two were hitchhiking across the entire continent together. Their journey took them to Niagara Falls, then to Cleveland to stay with Dr. Johnston's brother, then on to Chicago to see even more family, and finally to Los Angeles to visit a cousin. And by spending time with his relatives, Albert learned what it was like to live among other African Americans. But once he completed the spiritual journey, he decided to head back home, and he enrolled as a music major at the University of New Hampshire. He didn't know it at the time, but this decision would forever change the lives of the Johnston family. Their secret would soon be known by the entire nation. While he was at the University of New Hampshire, Albert Jr. befriended other black students, and this is something he hadn't had the opportunity to do back in either Gorham or Keene. One of these new black friends was a guy named Bill Ballard, and when he and Albert discovered that Academy Award-winning director Louis de Rochemont was living nearby in Newington, they decided to drive over and talk to him. It's unclear how they got this meeting, but one newspaper article I did read stated that Albert Jr. had met de Rochemont while he was giving a lecture on campus, but I couldn't confirm that. At the time, de Rochemont was at the peak of his fame, and that's because his March of Time newsreels have been seen by millions and millions of people. But once the war ended, he decided to focus on bigger projects, films. And he specialized in turning real stories that were filmed in real, actual locations, and he would turn those into hit movies. When they arrived at his home, the two explained to de Rochemont they were unhappy with the way black people were being portrayed on film. Audiences never got to see black doctors, black lawyers, and all the other black professionals. Well, they wanted to change that and suggested to de Rochemont that he make a film about someone like George Washington Carver or Booker T. Washington. So de Rochemont listened intently to what the boys had to say, and he could clearly see the dark color of Bill Ballard's skin, but he began to wonder why the light-skinned Albert Johnston would be so concerned over this. And that's when Albert told him he only learned about being black 2 years prior. Albert then proceeded to tell the whole story to de Rochemont, and he knew instantly this would be the subject of his next movie. But the catch was he wouldn't do it without the permission of Dr. and Mrs. Johnston. So Albert hitchhiked home and explained to his parents how de Rochemont wanted to tell their story on film. And the couple, they stayed up all night debating the pros and cons of revealing their secret. In particular, Dr. Johnston was concerned that he'd lose his position at the hospital and that the family would no longer be accepted as members of the community. But Thyra assured him that the people of Keene knew him well and that wouldn't happen. She also expressed that she was tired of hiding the truth. In the end, the couple agreed to have their story told, and they were paid $10,000. That's around $145,000 today, and all of that money was given to their children. Of course, making movies is costly, so de Rochemont needed to test the waters to see how receptive the public would be to a story about a black family that was passing as white. Well, it turns out he had an agreement with Reader's Digest that allowed him to provide them with story ideas, after which he retained the option to make them into film. Well, Reader's Digest liked the idea, and they asked William Lindsay White to pen the story. The result was the 92-page book titled Lost Boundaries, from which the magazine published a condensed version in their December 1947 issue. Amazingly, this story became one of the most popular ever published in the magazine up to that date, and soon production of the film began. The movie was one of the first major films in the United States to deal with race relations, and it starred Mel Ferrer and Beatrice Pearson. Lost Boundaries opened on June 22nd of 1949 at both the Colonial and Olympia theaters in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Then after that, it opened at the Astor Theater in New York City before finally going nationwide after that. Well, not exactly nationwide. It was banned in a couple of cities. The reviews were nearly universally positive, and de Rochemont was able to clear a profit on his investment. And I'm going to skip discussing the movie any further right now, and that's because my wife Mary Jane and I watched it a few weeks ago, and we plan to discuss it in the next episode of this podcast. But what I will say in advance is that there was something about this movie that was initially quite jarring, at least to me, but when it was over, the two of us really were still talking about it a week later. So stay tuned for that. Anyway, let's get back to the story. Meanwhile, back in Keene, the community had finally come to learn of the Johnstons' secret, and their response, although the press said it was positive, it was kind of a mixed bag. The fact is there have been rumors going around for years that they were black, but the reality was few people cared. And yes, there were those who were angered by the revelation. About 1 month after the movie's release, Dr. Johnson told those attending a New York Press Club's luncheon that if he could do it all over again, he wouldn't attempt to hide the fact that he was a black man. But things weren't so rosy in his professional life. There were repeated attempts by the Board of Trustees at the Keene Hospital to oust him from his radiologist position, and they finally succeeded in doing so in June of 1953. Now, the hospital claimed they dismissed him because he had neglected his duties, but the general consensus all around town was that he was let go because of the color of his skin. And while it was clearly a setback for Dr. Johnson, he wasn't unemployed, and that's because he was still on the staff of other regional hospitals, plus he anticipated this may happen. They've been trying to do it for years, so he had already set up a private practice on the first floor of his home. He would continue working there until his retirement in 1967. After that, the couple moved to Hawaii, and he continued to work as a part-time radiologist there. Dr. Albert Chandler Johnson passed away on June 23rd of 1988. He was 87 years old, and he requested that his body be taken back to Keene, the town that he loved, for burial, and that's what was done. His wife, Thyra Bauman Johnson, lived until November 22nd of 1995, and their son, Albert Jr., who we've talked about in the story, passed away in Hawaii in 2014. Useless, useful, I'll leave that for you to decide. Before we go, I just wanted to thank those who generously gave to the GoFundMe to help with the care of cartoonist Lee Rubin's wife, Teresa. Since I recorded that, there has been a bit of an update, and that is after 7 months, Teresa was moved to a facility that was closer to where they lived, and Lee was finally able to return home. And again, I just want to thank all those who contributed. Now, it was my wife Mary Jane who suggested that I tell the story of the Johnstons that you just heard. I had told her the basics of it a while back and suggested maybe, when she's on summer break, that we could record a review of it for the podcast. Well, that didn't quite work out. She's now back at her teaching job, and we never got it recorded. And that's because I had a chair fall on my neck about a month ago. Most people don't know this, but I recane chairs. I'll do 1, 2, 3 a year. Sometimes people ask me to do it. So I always have old chairs hanging from the rafters of our garage, and I don't pay much for them. They're usually free, $1, $2, something like that. But I always have extra chairs, so if I just want to recane one, there they are. Anyway, one day I grabbed a ladder to get something else out of the attic of our garage, and as I was coming down and just about to step off the ladder, something violently hit me right across the back of my neck. I have to tell you, it was quite the powerful jolt. I turned around and I saw this chair had fallen. But it wasn't any chair. It was the biggest, heaviest chair that I had in the garage. Now, my first instinct was to check both my hands and my feet to make sure I wasn't paralyzed. Honestly, the blow was so intense that I thought I would be. I was kind of surprised that I wasn't. That is definitely the closest I've ever come to being paralyzed. When Mary Jane got home, she was not happy with me. Well, I'm fine now. I had a lot of bruising on the back of my neck, and it made it painful to do anything, including working on this podcast, and that put me behind by like a week and a half, 2 weeks or so. Anyway, she's quite busy right now. The first few weeks of school as a teacher are always quite crazy, but we do hope to get that new episode recorded within the next couple of weeks or so. The Useless Information Podcast is available on all major podcast platforms, and of course the smaller ones also, so make sure you hit that follow button if you've never done so. The Useless Information Podcast is proud to be part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to explore their ever-growing collection of some of the best podcasts out there. As always, thanks for listening, and take care, everyone. Bye.